This is about suffering, neurodivergence and autism and ADHD. It can be seen as this is a fashionable issue, but there's about suffering people, sometimes very, very severe suffering, sometimes a bit less suffering, but it's about people who suffer. And as society, that makes it a political issue. I've had my own kind of personal development growth story around that. Just over 10 years ago, I realized that I'm autistic. But the thing is that it explained a lot of suffering.
Yes.
Suffering that hadn't made sense to me made more sense. But, you can't do much reading in this area or talk to too many people for too long without just having to think, no, there's political responsibilities here. There's a really serious set of issues. And, as an autistic person, as a therapist, as a citizen, you can't really just back away from the politics of it.
So let's expand on this with personal stories and client examples of autism advocacy and activism, not just the suffering. As we discussed today, autism, the political and the historical. Yeah, I mean, it's in a way quite a somber topic, isn't it, this time?
Yeah, I mean, something that sometimes has to be emphasized, I think, in various contexts. Some recent writers like Pete Warmby, I think, have emphasized it very well. And that is this whole issue, because I think in the media and so on, it can be seen as this is a fashionable issue, neurodivergence and autism and ADHD and so on. There's something recently, I think, in the Times. But this is about suffering.
Yeah.
There's about suffering people, sometimes very, very severe suffering, sometimes a bit less suffering, but it's about people who suffer. And as society, that makes it a political issue. If there are a substantial minority of people suffering in a particular way for particular reasons that maybe need addressing, well, then we're talking political issue of some kind. So details of that, I suppose, is something we want to just tease out a bit of, at least today.
Yeah, because we mentioned it, didn't we, last week, at the end of the show last week, where we were saying about as an individual choosing how much you devote yourself to the cause and how much you don't, and how to get that balance right for you at any one time. And then people might have been thinking, well, what cause? What do you mean? What cause? And that's when we said, didn't we, that we will go into highlighting that, because there is a social justice issue here.
Well, I've had my own kind of personal development growth story around that. Just over 10 years ago, I realized that I'm autistic. It was actually the 4th of November 2012. I mean, obviously I'd been thinking about it a lot up until then, and I thought a lot about it afterwards. But on that day, I woke up thinking I was probably autistic. And by the time I went to bed, I thought, well, I obviously am. Come on now. Right. What do we do about this? And it was...
That's quite amazing, actually, considering it took me 3 years to do that. You did it in one day. Good for you.
Well, no, I mean, there was a lot of lead up. I was reading a lot, and I was working with a few autistic clients, and I was thinking about a huge amount, but I was still wondering that morning, but I wasn't wondering anymore by the end of the day. It was like, well, okay, this is just it now, and that's clear. It's obvious. Let's work with it. But the thing is that, like for a lot of people, the crucial help in that, the wonder of that and the positivity of it, along with lots of grief and so on, was that it explained a lot of suffering.
Yes.
Suffering that hadn't made sense to me made more sense.
Yeah.
But I was very much focused on myself, obviously, for a few years. Even though I was already a therapist, I was working with some clients and I was interested in learning more and so on, but I was doing a lot of work on myself. But I would never have thought of it as a political kind of issue, just a very personal issue. It's like, well, okay, good, I've discovered this, that's handy for me. And then I began to get more and more into it from a professional side and want to learn more about, well, how does that mean about working with people? And then I got a little more sense of, I mean, it wasn't that I didn't know that there could be political dimension, but I just wasn't interested for the moment. And then in work, I was a bit more aware because, there's parallels, pretty obvious ones to the area of LGBTQ issues, minorities. And so, clearly we can see the political issues there and they're not gone. But I was a little bit resistant. I just want to stay in the therapy room, and not think too much about that. But, you can't do much reading in this area or talk to too many people for too long without just having to think, no, there's political responsibilities here. There's a really serious set of issues. And, as an autistic person, as a therapist, as a citizen, you can't really just back away from the politics of it. And by politics, obviously, we don't necessarily mean like, national politics, party politics, all of that, though partly that, but also, we just mean daily interactions and workplaces and school systems and things like that.
No, that's it, isn't it? Because we're talking about systemic and systematic barriers to equal access, and exclusion from and inaccessibility to and undeservingness of access to, or ways that it's delivered in terms of the big three, really, at least, which is the healthcare, education and employment.
Yeah, they are certainly the big ones, and we'll tease through at least a bit of some of them today, see how far we get. But I think deservingness is a great word because, the word that was coming to mind for me was the obvious one. It was rights, and human rights. And that's a powerful term. But deservingness is a nice, simple word, I think, that captures the same kind of thing. Because I think I wouldn't have thought of myself necessarily initially as having any rights in this area, whereas I've come to realize we all do, like any different group, any minority, any set of people who have a joint difference. We have a right to have rights. We actually need to get the confidence that there's a certain deservingness, around all of this, a demand for change, a sense that we're entitled for various areas of particularly those big three to improve, to come into line with what's going to be an increasingly vocal minority. That's the interesting thing. And I think, one of the things we were talking about around this the other day was, that like, even just alerting clients who discover they're autistic to the fact that, by the way, there's a political dimension. They don't have to go there and we don't have to talk about it, but just to plant that, again, I'm going to use that word deservingness now in the future, just to plant that seed of saying, you make, as you start to get more and more work through your unmasking, for instance, which is what we were talking about recently, you may start to realize that you deserve a lot better, and that a lot of other autistic people deserve a lot better, and you may start to really, find that this political dimension is a big part of even your own recovery, your own growth, your own, living a better life.
And adjustment and everything. Because neurodiversity on its own, that word just means that every mind is unique, the diversity of minds, whereas the neurodiversity movement, we're talking there about diversity has value, we're valuing all minds. So that means equality, that means equity, that means inclusion, doesn't it? That means accommodating and valuing, modifying, like the design and delivery of therapy, for one thing, not medical interventions anymore, like we could go into the history of things, but it's more now about looking at quality of life instead of fixing or curing. We're not aiming to make people anymore be indistinguishable from people who aren't neurodivergent. Why would you if everyone has equal value?
And huge part of that, and I suppose this is another reason that it's been going kind of deeper and deeper into my own agenda, is once you do any bit of training, as we do, with any group, mostly with therapists in our case, again, you begin to become more and more aware that one of the essential things that's needed, and in a way nothing else can follow unless you get this, is vast improvement in widespread understanding of what it is to be autistic and to have ADHD and other forms of neurodivergence. But, that's the, like, awareness isn't enough. Changes will have to happen, but not even the right changes can happen until people have a clear, more accurate idea, not just of the general idea of what autism is or isn't, though that's really important, what you can learn in a workshop or in a book, but what is, called the double empathy problem. Until there's better cross-cultural communication, until people actually know how to talk to autistic people when they say they're autistic, again, something else we talked about a few weeks ago, until people think of being autistic as something that's just familiar and people they know are autistic and it's not a big deal, except that you may have to make adjustments. You simply may need to take that into account. You might have to do a bit of the adjusting. So it's at the individual level always, isn't it, partly? But then, as you said, the systemic part is huge and takes a long time to change. It really does.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it's everything, it's everything. It took me a while to realize, it took me really that 3 years to realize that neurotype is everything, or neurodiversity, is everything in therapy. It's not just a little thing, or it's just a little thing that's extra. It's everything, because it's about the way that people communicate, how they process things, how they might know about what's going on internally and what they do or don't decide to express for different reasons or for different abilities or different ways of doing. And if that's not understood, how can therapy work when it's all done within the container of a relationship?
Yeah, and I suppose, that sort of political awareness, political nous, political tuned inness is, again, I'm accepting that much more and more strongly for myself. It's something that a therapist, I think, has to have, like we have to have when we're working with various cultural minorities, when we're working with, trans clients. We have to understand the psychology and, therapeutic implications and typical life stories and things like that. But we also have to understand just what it feels like to be, in that place in society, and not just how that feels and how we might help, but just in a way, even just acknowledging and affirming how wrong that is.
Mm-hmm.
Even though it's not going to suddenly change.
So like with the historical things, it's not just that those things happened then, but that they form society's views, and that impacts people today and has done throughout their lives. They might not have known why or how, but it's there, isn't it? Things are in the collective unconscious. So things that have gone before, that's why history is important in terms of marginalization, oppression, views, because these things don't just go away. As you were saying earlier, these things take time to change. They change over time, and it's not just one day it's like this and the next day it isn't. Yeah,
and these things are hugely internalized. Various forms of ableism, as we would say, are internalized. I can't actually think of a specific example now, but I think I've looked back and found myself almost, not necessarily thinking, oh God, I wasn't against that back then, but even maybe I was even fighting for it. How did I think that way? How did I think that was okay? As I say, I can't think of an example right now, but it's very internalized. And again, I think without, getting on our soapboxes with clients, it is only right, I think, and necessary to alert them to that they may be, in a sense, oppressing themselves still in ways that can be framed very personally, but also which need to be framed politically and societally. They need to be framed systemically. And I think that it's a good idea to illustrate that a bit. You talked about the three main settings, educational, healthcare, and employment. One of the ways this comes into the therapy room, and we can maybe illustrate this a little bit now, is that those are actual examples then of what people are struggling with. And, we can't march out and change the system, but we can help the clients, maybe get a bit of a different view of what's going on and where the responsibility lies and where they don't need to blame themselves. And we can encourage and help them brainstorm ways forward, and we can help them to be more assertive, and we can help them to know the law and things like that.
And feel confident in being able to work with autistic people and know in which ways to support them and which ways to enlighten, or, as a general, but also as an individual person, because each client obviously is an individual person as well, but they're set within the context of this historical and political landscape.
Healthcare is an interesting one, I think. I mean, work is another big one that I come across, employment settings, but healthcare, there's been interesting research done on this even recently. Healthcare, including mental health care, of course, which is something that is much closer to the work that we do. But yeah, the experiences of autistic people in GP surgeries and in psychiatric hospitals and really other healthcare settings is really quite shocking and just very sad, because often small adjustments in attitude or procedure would make absolutely massive difference to autistic people. Stop it being a nightmare and turn it into something reasonably doable.
Well, I mean, obviously, of course, years and years ago, everybody would have been institutionalized if they were deemed socially undesirable. They were seen as unfixable or wrong, or it made everyone uncomfortable. They would have been put into an institution, and I was thinking about it today before we came on today, and thinking about in the early days of the first half of the century, say, with the Leo Kanner stuff from he was an American doctor, but he was a refugee from Vienna, apparently. He, really was instrumental in shaping society's view of disabled people, in that euthanasia was popular in those days, not necessarily from Kanner, but certainly from Kennedy. Foster Kennedy, not President Kennedy, who was a neurologist. But then, words like in the later half of the century, like mental retardation, and Kanner wrote the paper calling something in his findings autistic psychopathology. So he'd sort of recognized some elements of a small number of the population, because obviously in those days they thought it was a lot rarer, didn't they? But was calling it a psychopathology. And then later on there was the refrigerator mother theory. So it went from here are the bad people, here are the ones who are wrong, let's institutionalize them, then to, well, hang on a moment, this is what's wrong, there's a pathology here and it's these type of people, to, well, this is now, let's find out why. Then various theories started to come about over time, such as the refrigerator mother theory that's now been largely discredited, the vaccines one about, the heavy metals thing that causes autism. So there's a belief about that something must have caused it, that it's triggered by something.
Yeah, and that then hopefully we could fix it and get rid of it, rather than actually just expand our society a bit to adjust. And
based on because it's wrong, which was from the days when they used to institutionalize a lot of people that were different.
Yeah. And I suppose the kind of way that society has changed maybe since mid 20th century and just become much more kind of bureaucratic and office based and school based, and in a way good moves like, well, make sure every child has an education, but also the expanding middle class, every child should get a third level education, and the increase in white collar jobs, all of that has a lot of historians of this area would say has had a big impact on the pathologization of various disabilities, not just kind of areas that we're talking about. But again, that is at some level, becoming a political issue. I think it is actually going to become a political issue in terms of simply growth of numbers and big lobby groups and demand for change. We're not quite at that level yet, but it's starting to show as an issue that's going to increase. And I suppose quite a lot of autistic people, again, according to the research and the history, but also a lot of clients that we meet anecdotally, have had multiple pathologization, because they've been diagnosed with autism, but only as something that needs to be fixed, and then a whole lot of other things thrown on top, or not diagnosed with autism, but diagnosed with borderline personality disorder or something like that instead. But all in the same vein of, obviously, you're the one with the problem. Nobody needs to adjust on our side. I think that one of the practical, political, in the broadest sense, needs, like, changes that needs to happen, and would be something that would need, a political push from a lot of directions. I suspect it's hardly likely to just happen from inside, systemically, is in psychiatric services. I think anyone presenting at psychiatric services for any sort of mental health problem, anxiety, depression, suicidality, eating disorders, everybody should have a basic screening for autism and ADHD.
Yeah. Not
a full-blown assessment, but an initial screening. Literally everybody, no matter what they're presenting with. Now that we know how potentially prevalent it is, and the huge links it has potentially with developing mental health problems, and with even masquerading as other mental health problems. So there are these huge things that are going to become battlegrounds, I think, down the line, because to me that just seems an obvious need. But of course it'll cost money, and it'll involve retraining, and in all sorts of alterations in services that are very entrenched. So that's just one example.
Yeah, and I presume you're not saying that people should be screened for that because neurodivergent people have mental health. That is a mental health issue.
Quite the opposite. The opposite. Yeah.
Because we're back again with the political, aren't we? It's how come those things have happened to that person, or that person has, evolved or behaved or responded or coped in those kinds of ways that have had knock-on problems, with the interface with society and the systems and so on, of people not knowing, or them not knowing, or not being accommodated or valued.
And a big area that has had a bit of research, and that autistic people have begun to talk about a lot, is GP care. Mm-hmm. The points that people make are things like, why on earth do you have to make a phone call to make an appointment? Why can you not just send an email to make an appointment? In so many practices, and why do you have to be then kept on hold for ages while you're waiting to make that appointment, and all this stuff that's annoying for a lot of people, but can just utterly be overwhelming for some autistic people. The sort of system of having to turn up and wait in a crowded waiting room. I've read stories of autistic people who are saying to the receptionist, well, I'll just wait outside and you can just call me when the doctor's ready. Oh no, you can't do that. I can't be getting up and calling you in. Simple little things like that. And that's apart altogether from the actual massive double empathy problems that arise with a lot of GPs still, who just don't have the knowledge. The client is saying, look, I'm autistic, so the way I explain things is going to be a bit different. Just so far beyond the capacity of a lot of doctors.
Yeah, it can be. And actually, definitely autistic adults need a lot of support around making healthcare decisions or having appointments. There's nothing wrong with taking somebody with you. But because anecdotally, I've heard this lots of times as well, going to the GP and saying, oh, well, because the GPs will often these days ask you, what do you think it is or what's up? Because they know that Google exists. And, you'll describe it and say, well, I think it's this because this, and this. And they'll be like looking and saying, and I've heard this a few times, oh, well, it can't be because you'd be rolling around the floor on agony. And for the autistic patient to say, I am. And then it's just not registering with the GP that when you're saying, yes, I am, that because you're not displaying that, because it's not the typical presentation. And that's what we mean by double empathy. It's not a lack of empathy. It's not having empathy for the reality of the other person because of the way that you think that should be displayed or that should be transmitted or received between people.
Yeah, I know it's a big area, and we might even come back to it again in a bit more detail. And I suppose I'm just thinking back then to, again, the therapist's role in all of this, because, sometimes it's discussion of these struggles that clients have. And I certainly have done that with various clients around healthcare situations and just trying to help them to think of other ways to try and get the message across or ask for some sort of accommodation. But also just help them lick their wounds afterwards. That's the reality, I can't say that I've seen huge amounts of change. Every now and then they're lucky and somebody's, willing to make the alterations. But it is sometimes at the moment we're just supporting people who just have to keep putting themselves in situations that aren't going to change easily because they're systemic and because people don't see enough reason to pressure to change, for the occasional person. Work is the other big one, maybe for us to touch into at least. We'll see if we might not get as far as education, so we might just do another follow up on this. But what seems to be happening in the world of work at the moment is that organizations and companies have copped on to the fact that this is a political issue, as in it's an issue that they have to take a position on and be seen to take a position on and be seen to take the right position on. So they are starting to talk about being neurodiversity affirming and things like that. Of course, what we're often dealing with in the therapy room, even with a client who's working in a company who talks the talk, is of course that in fact, again, they're just having nightmare experiences.
Well, as they say, results may vary.
Yes.
And so the policies are there, the laws are there. There are things that are against the law and that should be in place because it's the law to do so. But in the end, it's translated by individual people who might not be being malicious or negligent, literally might be misinterpreting or not understanding. And only think about it, how easy could it be for a therapist to be listening to a client talking about their workplace and, as you say, supporting, maybe injustice or the struggle of, seemingly, being in situations that are challenging. And then it could be so easy for a therapist in the end, after a long story and a long examination and a lot of dialogue around it, to close up with an off-the-cuff comment of, well, sometimes that's just how people are. These are very little subtle ways of saying, you just have to accept it. That's the dominant way. They're not like you, they're like that, and you just have to suck it up, basically. And it's knowing where is the line. When do you help the client to cope with reality and accept certain things, but also making a decision to save their energy or decide which battles to fight?
Which battles to fight can be a big one. Certainly, I think, as they say, tone of voice is also important. Like you can say, maybe that's just something that, in the end of it all, we're going to have to find ways to put up with. I suppose is a very different way of saying it in an airy, off the cuff sort of way, you know.
And if the client comes to that conclusion, all you do between you for good reason, rather than as a way to close it down.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, particularly because of which battles to fight. I mean, I think this piece is very real, and I think we should pick this up next time and talk more about the workplace in general, with the kind of political dimension in mind, but also with, you know, the work we can do with clients in mind, because I've a few stories certainly about all of this with various clients, and, you know, trying to in one way help them and encourage them and to go and ask, and to, but also kind of protect themselves in terms of their privacy and, you know, confidentiality. You know, there's all the balance between, am I just drawing attention to myself that's going to make things worse, or do I, you know, ask for my rights? And you know, I've been through supporting one client through a major battle and a major sort of, you know, bringing an internal complaint, you know, well, not quite complaint, but, you know, request that went formally to a committee, and he involved the union in it and everything. And it got at least partial, you know, value out of doing that. But it was a big thing to do, because it drew a lot of attention to himself and took him a huge amount of energy.
Well, I say
there's massive amounts of energy. Now, it was worth his while. He doesn't regret it, but like other times I've seen the opposite. I've seen, look, maybe we actually were just going to drop this because this is just going to wear you out and it doesn't look like you're getting anywhere, you know, and that's very sad.
Well, yes. I mean, it's all right to choose, though, isn't it? If all you can do is take stock of the costs and the energy requirements and the you know, what's at hand, and as best as possible try and make the right choice for yourself. Because as you know, autistic people can get very much into the integrity of what's right. Yes, but it's not right, and they can sometimes forget that I'm a human being and this is going to cost me. It's going to mean that I'm going to be you know, reared up about it, or I'm going to be pursuing something, or there's lots of paperwork, or all the things that, you know, that there may be social consequences. I've still got to go in, say, to that workplace every day, or something like that. It's going to be extremely uncomfortable, stressful, frightening. You know, it might not be, though. That's why each case is individual, isn't it? And each person's individual as to what their level of resilience and support is, and how, you know, what it means to them to pursue it compared to the costs of doing so. And
maybe it's an interesting note to finish on, because we're on the time there. That particular client that I'm talking about, working in a very large organization, he specifically, consciously was saying, this is going to be tough. There's no guarantee of the outcome. I'm sometimes not sure whether I maybe should just drop the case, you know, and take it no further. But I partly want to do this for other people. So he was consciously political. The political dimension was clear for him. He was saying, I want to do this for me. I'm fed up with it. It's not right. But also there will be more other people behind me in this organization. So somebody's got to start the ball rolling. Somebody's got to start to raise the awareness. So he was consciously political about it. He was probably wasn't just doing it for himself. He was doing it for everybody, in a sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, he was very aware of what we're talking about today, the political dimension of all of this, you know, the individual experiencing something that we're beginning to become aware lots of people are experiencing, and that's not right. Yeah.
No, and it's not surprising in the least to hear you say that, because obviously I've too had clients doing that, pursuing those kinds of avenues, or deciding whether to or not, you know.
But then social justice is quite a strong theme for autistic people, isn't it?
Yeah.
So, you know, if there's any group that are able to start a social justice movement, it'll be autistic people. So it has started, but, you know, in other words, to really grow one, you know, like there's a great passion for social justice anyway, I think, in a lot of autistic people. So
and
that's
with the advent of the internet, you see, you've got the chorus of voices,
totally,
people able to self-publish and self-broadcast.
Yeah, it's happening much quicker than the, you know, gay pride movement, for instance, because of the internet. Yeah, it's changing on a weekly basis, you know. So yeah, it's a very serious issue, but it is also very interesting what's happening politically. Yeah. But look, I think it sounds like we'll come back to some of this next time. Maybe tease out a few examples even of client experiences.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Great.
Yeah,
Okay.
obviously.
That's grand. Well, look, we'll leave it there for this week, and hopefully see some or all of you next week.
Yes, thanks for joining us. We'll draw to a close then, and thanks for coming.
Thanks, everyone.
Join us next couple of weeks if you want to. It's the same link all month. We'd love you to be here. Yeah, good and lively chat, wasn't it?
Oh yeah. It's kind of pushing things out another bit, isn't it? Even for
That's
us.
a real nice. That was a real meaty episode, actually. I could imagine if people don't use that for referencing, then they're missing a big trick, because it was packed full of stuff. It had history in it. It had literal overview of what we're talking about. It had the specifics of the big areas, explanations as to why, with current client examples and personal examples that you kindly gave. I mean, there was everything in there. There's everything, actually. I don't think we could have done it better if we'd have written.
No. Well, it was interesting. Yeah, there was so much covered. Yeah, so much covered. And I do think that, we should come back to it next time. Maybe talk a bit more about workplace, because it is such a big daily one, even healthcare isn't like a daily thing. And education, it's a more difficult one from my point of view, because I don't work with children, so I'm not talking about people's school experiences. Obviously, lots of my clients talk about their school experiences in the past, though, as autistic people, and I am working with autistic people in third level education, which has its challenges, though I have to say it's a bit like LGBTQ issues. University campuses are one of the more friendly places to differences. If you're different, if you're a minority, well, then a university campus is not the worst place to be, but even that's worth talking about, because that's political again. It just means that the politics of the university usually is a bit more progressive and a bit more open and a bit ahead of things, that doesn't mean there aren't challenges, of course, but
there's usually a society. There's normally like when I was at Sheffield Hallam, you made a learning contract, so there was a disability support, and they would talk through with you what you think that your accommodations needed to be, which is a good one to talk about, actually, because the way that they went about it was really helpful. Because when you're realizing that you're autistic and you haven't known all of your life, you don't suddenly be able to walk around and say, oh, now I can tell everyone what I need, because I'm still finding out as well.
Oh, totally. This is the thing. Yeah. No, let's come back to then.
And they had a lovely interview process that helped to tease it out, actually. And I think there's ways of going about it as a therapist, to be able to support and advise clients when they're going into this kind of thing with their work.
Exactly. That's the bit that we touched into a little bit, but that's the interesting bit, I think.
It's not just what they might want accommodating, but it's how they interact with the whole process.
Yeah, it's kind of coaching a little bit in a way, people,
and what to think about and what to expect and how you might go about it.
Exactly. Great. Okay.
All right.
Cool. Great stuff. See you then.
Yeah, thanks. See you then. Bye.
Bye.